All right, first things first, can you guys see my screen? And do I need to move the Zoom? There we go.
I think it looks good.
All right. So let's see, make sure I'm on the right screen. For anybody that wasn't sure, this is a talk called CSS is Totally Rad, and we going over some CSS fundamentals, some tips and tricks, and a little bit into SCSS and some high-level techniques there. This is me. I'm Evan Dunham. I'm a UX engineer in Sacramento, California, and spent last 10 years building a whole lot of websites, background in graphic design, and made the jump to the dark side, if you will, into code a while back, and it's been a fun journey ever since. So this quote I thought was it was great. It says, "CSS is weird. It's unlike any other code, and that makes a lot of programmers uncomfortable. But used wisely, it can in fact be awesome." As I've found that there's a lot of guys and gals that they may know a lot about JavaScript or whatever framework of the month is out right now, and they really can't write CSS. And so it's always blown my mind how simple CSS can be for me or anybody that's been using it for a long time, and how it can be confusing to other people. And it's just different skill sets, but I find it to be the easier solution as I struggle with other technologies. But what is CSS? So cascading style sheets describe how HTML elements are to be described or to be displayed on screen, paper, and other media. And so in the syntax of it is that we've got a selector and a declaration block. And some selectors can be just elements themselves, whether it's a div, a span, a paragraph, anchor, list item, button, input, and then we have class examples that you'll see a period in front of it, or an ID, which is represented by the hash symbol or pound sign. So using those, we'll have some declarations, and we'll set a property of the color and the value to red, or the text transform to uppercase, and the text align to center. And so it's a little bit high level of how that works. So seeing it in action, maybe we'll just have this H1 where the color is white and the font size is, let's say, 48 pixels in this example, and there's a text declaration underline and the font weight is bold. Now, where that would be different is maybe another example where we have text transform uppercase and we apply some letter spacing, and in this case, the font weight is normal. So if anybody's not familiar with CSS, you can quickly see we could define these properties and how we want our styles to appear. So that's a little bit about CSS and what it does. But one of the big things that I struggled with when I was first learning CSS was specificity. And so with that, there's a really cool article that Andy Clark wrote called the Css Specificity Wars, in which he defines, the elements, the classes, the IDs, and then just the inline style. And it has this range of, like, there's the least powerful and the most powerful. And if you're a fan of Star Wars, you'll see that, well, clearly a stormtrooper is less than Darth Maul, which is less than Darth Vader, and so on, and then just inline styles. But underneath each of those, you'll see there's represented by some set of numerals. So it's like 0, 0, 0, 1, and that shows you kind of the I'll get into that in a second, how that works. So take this first stormtrooper, and it's just an anchor element. So its Sith power is 1. Whereas if you're trying to hook into a paragraph, and then the anchor in that paragraph has a Sith power of 2. But then if we were just hook into this element or this class of foo, which is the class selector, its Sith power is already like 10 times higher than the previous one. So you can see that's indicated with 0, 1, 0. And then that can start compounding upon itself. So if you take Darth Maul, add another stormtrooper in there, he's that much more powerful. And this continues on and on and on as you start getting more and more specific as to what you're hooking into. And where this happens a lot is depending on maybe a theme that you inherited that you're working on. There might be very specific selectors, and you want to avoid having to use an ID or an important or some other hook in there. But that gives you a sense of how you can just up the specificity a tiny bit and hook into that element. Now you get into Darth Vader on the right there, where it's an ID and its Sith power is not much more than the rest of these. And again, it keeps going on and on with the Sith power. And then ultimately what you get to is if you've got an inline style on the element, that's going to override anything that's declared in your CSS file. And so that's one that you can't undo in your styles. So a couple other things to note is don't do important that with to keep this analogy going, that counts as Death Star. You just don't do that. And there's other hooks, like if you're using like a pseudo class selector, that they'll all kind of the same specificity. And yeah, that's kind of a key thing to wrap your head around. But the big takeaway though is we want to keep our specificity as low as possible, so that way you don't create a problem for yourself down the line or another developer and how they're having to figure out how exactly they can override those styles.
So sorry to interrupt, but that exclamation and then important, that is not good practice?
That's terrible practice.
Okay, I've seen that before. I just didn't really know.
There's usually it's a symptom of not being able to wrestle through finding a better hook depending on who wrote the initial CSS, and you will find other devs that will come in and be like, you know what, I don't have many other options. There's very rare edge cases where it could be possible, but they're useful. But for the most part, it's a symptom of a bigger underlying issue, because once the importance there, now everything after that has to be important again. So you just want to avoid that at all costs. There'll be some cases where I think the Bootstrap framework on some of their styles, whether it's like the alert backgrounds and maybe some coloring styles that gets applied to text and backgrounds, will use important to kind of strong arm the theme styles. But as far as best practice goes, I do not advocate using it at all.
Okay.
I saw it.
Does that help?
I saw it
Go ahead.
recently used.
So that's that, but definitely look it up. There's check it out, Andy Clark Specificity Wars. There's a lot of information about that. I like the illustrations on how he explained this, as can be difficult to wrap your head around. But if you put Star Wars on it, it's instantly it makes sense. So the next bit I want to go over here is the Css Zen Garden. So way back when I first started writing CSS, there was this book that came out. It was like the Zen of CSS design. And it took this concept where you have this page of HTML, but if you throw CSS at it, what can we do with it? And this is when CSS was still relatively new. And as I fill the screen here, all of these websites have the same markup. They just have a different CSS file applied to it. And for me, when I was learning CSS, it just blew my mind that the HTML wasn't changing. It's like it's only CSS. And that actually allowed me to really wrap my head around just how powerful CSS was very early on. And just to know that there's a difference between HTML and CSS and what they can do. And yeah, there's going to be cases where the visual layout of something is going to be very much influenced by your HTML needs to be a specific way to be able to style it accordingly, but it's powerful to see what they can do with just a CSS file, and all of these link to each other so you can see what other designers had done. I believe this is still alive in some form, but it's neat checking that out still. So with that, as CSS evolved and got more and more powerful and more browser supported different technologies, came the adoption of preprocessors, and you'll see Sass and less. For me, for the most part, they're going to have 90% similar functionality. There's going to be a few cases where less as something where you can define a variable or thing to mix in, and it doesn't have to be in the order that it compiles in, or it won't throw an error. But I prefer to work in SCSS. So I'm going to go over a little bit of details about that and why it's cool, because it's pretty much like your CSS on steroids. So you learn more about it at Sassmeister. Oh, that might be an old URL. But one of the things you can do with it that's super powerful is nesting. So when you're writing styles out, and I want to style out this list item, I can nest this list item within the unordered list, and it quickly communicates the hierarchy between the base element of the unordered list and then the nested element of the list item. And so as you're parsing through a style sheet, you can start to see the DOM structure. And I find that to be powerful, and you'll see a couple examples of that here. You could also do some concatenation with it using the ampersand symbol. And how you can do that, and again with the nesting, is you may define some styles for your anchor, and then using the ampersand, you could then define your hover style, so it keeps all of your styles in one block. Another way where that's powerful is using like a pseudo element with a before or after. And when those get compiled down, it's going to just get to be what you'd expect to be an anchor, hover, this thing, and the before pseudo element. So it can help with readability as what's going on as you're defining like the active state, the hover state, and then maybe different classes based on that. Another way it's powerful to be used is if you're using like maybe the base element is accordion, and then you're maybe using BEM syntax, which I'll get into in a little bit, and you want to ultimately keep your specificity low because it's just one class, and then you can write the styles for just that selector and not have to have two different classes on it. A little bit about variables. They're defined with a $ symbol, and they'll look just like this, where it says variable. And an example of that was I could define a variable called brand blue. And so I've got this nifty blue that I then could pass into my anchor, and I'm going to set the color to brand blue. And then when the CSS compiles, it's going to render out based on what the value of that variable is. Now, this is extremely powerful because say you're using this blue throughout the document for your theme styles, and you get a change from the design that the blue needs to be like 10% darker. You can just update that one variable, and then it will pass through your entire theme. Depending on how you have that structured, that can be good or bad, but there's ways to define your variables with different tokens to reference the original theme or the original variable color. But I found it incredibly useful hunting down the variable rather than hex colors. So that gets into then mixins in SCSS, and they're defined using an @ symbol. So you can create one by doing @mixin example, and then you could use it or call it using @include example. So it's going to be a little wall of code here in a second, but we'll explain it. So I have this awesome mixin that I've called example. And I've got two arguments that I pass in here. There's a couple things you can do. Is you could define these arguments to have default values. So if you don't, when you call the mixin, if you don't explicitly declare a value for it, it'll use that default value. So in this case, we're going to set the background color to the first argument, and we're going to then also use that same value to generate the hover color, and we're going to darken it by 5%. So it's, again, saving some time on how that works. And then we're going to set the border radius to default 4 pixels. That's what BR is there. So in a practical use case, is we've got this class of button, and we want to include the button mixin, and we're passing in the color of blue. The first argument is going to set the background to blue, and then I've mocked up the 5% darker color underneath it, and that will be generated for you. Alternatively, you can pass in red as the base color, and then we can change what the border radius is down to 0 pixels. But it will use the same formula for calculating the hover colors and font size and everything with it. So you can quickly build a variety of different button styles that are consistent just by passing in a couple different variables. One thing that I've heard a lot of people that are learning SCSS for the first time or less is like might be a little bit of overhead of ramping up and how to use that, and how do they use it like locally on their machine. You know, are you going to use CodeKit to compile it? Are you going to use like a gulp or a grunt task? And there's so many different ways that you can compile the Sass files into a CSS file. But if you just want to tinker around and get a sense of how that works, you can check out his website called Sassmeister.com, and it's powerful because you can have SCSS on the left panel and it will show the compiled CSS on the right panel, and get familiar with some of that. And it's fun to see folks that haven't used SCSS before when they have that aha moment of just how powerful it is. And then they will quickly put in systems in place to always use SCSS. Another nice quote here by the same gentleman on the first slide is, he said, CSS is hard because its properties interact often in unexpected ways, because when you set one of them, you're never setting that one thing. That one thing combines and bounces off and contradicts with a dozen other things, including default things. And so if you're new to CSS, or maybe if you worked with CSS for a long time, you know it's exactly the case. Like, it's just, it does lots of things. And so this animation demonstrates that perfectly. So now we'll go into what I'm calling totally rad CSS selectors. And then there's this awesome article on Toots Plus, and it has 30 CSS selectors you must memorize. And I've cherry picked a couple of them out of here that are really powerful selectors. So one is the adjacent selector. So it will select only the element that is immediately preceded by the former element. So maybe you want to style a list item after a list item, or maybe it's the paragraph after heading 2. And so that way you can have your global styles for paragraphs, but the first one right after a heading, maybe you want the font size a little bit larger. So the plus symbol is powerful to hook into the immediate sibling. There's the child combinator, which will target only the direct children. So it can control the specificity. So maybe you have 10 layers deep of markup and you don't want to select every list item, just the first list item. Where you'll see this is maybe there's drop-down navigation where you only want to target the first level of list items, not the ones that fly out underneath a menu. This will allow you to target just those top level nav items. Another powerful one is the sibling combinator. So it's similar to the plus symbol, but any siblings, not just the immediate preceding sibling. And I'll have an example for how this works in just a little bit. Another powerful one is using the attribute selector, where typically a CSS developer would think, oh, what's the class on this thing? Or how do I style against is it a paragraph, an anchor, list item, maybe an ID? But you can actually hook into the element based on a different attribute value. And so there's a series of equations that can be used to target that. So if the attribute equals a declared value, do some styles. Where this is pretty common is maybe you want to style an input, which type is text. This is powerful because maybe you don't have a consistent hook class on each of those, but you can target maybe the form that holds them or the field set that holds them, and then style all those inputs with this selector right there. Another totally rad selector is if the attribute contains a declared value. Maybe you want to style all of your links that contain the word YouTube to be bold and red, so that you can look to make sure that the href contains the word YouTube, and then style the link accordingly. Another one is when the attribute begins with a declared value. So maybe it's an image path. If it's in a specific folder, you can target it based on the start of it. Another one is then if an attribute ends with the declared value. And where this is powerful is maybe you have an anchor that ends in a PDF. You can style it to have maybe a PDF icon in front of it based on you knowing that you're linking to a PDF without having to put a class that says PDF link on it. So it's pretty powerful. A couple others here is that you can use the pseudo elements. I use those all the time for decorative elements or like maybe borders and different techniques. Now we're getting into the weeds here. We get nth child and nth last child. So if you want to target maybe the even list items or the odd ones, or every 3 starting with the 4th, that you can do some pretty complicated CSS selectors that really help you target a specific element. Another powerful one is the nth of type, which is different than just, oops, going the wrong direction there. There's nth child, which is agnostic to the element itself. But say you want to target the 3rd heading 3 within this div, you can target it with the nth of type. So it may be the 10th element in that div, but it's the 2nd one in that group. So a lot of cool things you can do with that. More commonly, you'll see if somebody's hooking into the first child, last child, or only child, because many, many years ago, we were having to put the class of first and last on different elements just to undo a bottom margin or remove a right border on something. Now you can hook into it with just last child. So that's a little bit of the selectors. And now one of my favorite parts about CSS is using Flexbox. And when it first came out, I would admit that I was terrified with how that works because my brain only worked in floats at the time. And it's like, well, what is this? How does this work? Browser Support was getting adopting it more and more. And then I found this wonderful article called A Complete Guide to Flexbox on CSS Tricks, because they were able to illustrate it quite well. So how you use Flexbox is you can set an item's display to flex. So we've got this container that's set to display flex. Well, it's not doing too much right now, but we could set a flex direction, and that's going to establish the main axis of this container. So now we may have a couple elements that will set the flex direction to row, or we could have the elements go in reverse order, do flex direction, row, reverse. Another value we can set is the flex direction to column or column reverse. So to do this sort of stuff, I don't even know how you would do it with floats. It just opened up a whole Pandora's box of possibilities of laying out content. Where it becomes even more powerful is the flex wrap value. And you could set the container to allow the items to wrap to a new line. So now creating grid systems was pretty easy with just a few lines of CSS. You can do what would have taken dozens of lines of CSS and a lot of additional hooks on the nested elements before. To get a little bit deeper in here, now there's justify content. So you could then adjust the alignment along the axis. So if you got 3 nested yellow blocks in this purple box, you can set the justify content to the left, or sorry, the flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, space evenly. It's just incredibly powerful that one value can create a completely different layout. Additionally, you can align those items on a different axis. So that way you may have it aligned all the way to the left, but then at the top or at the bottom or the center, maybe you want all these items stretched. It's pretty powerful what you can do with just a couple properties. And so I'll get into some practical examples of how that would work in just a moment. Now, if you have multiple rows, when you've set the flex items to wrap, you could also control whether those items align at the flex start of that container, the flex end. It's just a really robust solution. So a practical use case is maybe on the small breakpoints, you have this module that it's flexed at this point where you set the flex direction to column. But on the larger breakpoints, you would just set the flex direction to row. And so without having to go in and refactor the markup, you can have 2 very different styles as you have more screen real estate to accommodate that card. And so where those awesome CSS selectors can be useful is maybe it's the even items, you're going to set the flex direction to row reverse. So you kind of create this alternating tile pattern. So that way it's not just stacking all the images on the left. And you don't have to go in and manually add a class for the items that you want to switch this. It could be based on just the source order of it. So if you go back in and you start reordering things, you don't have to worry about changing the class that's on it. It will just be handled through the nth child. And to me, I find that incredibly powerful. It's a lot to take in, but I definitely would recommend checking out this A Complete Guide to Flexbox. It's I referenced it a lot, and still do. If I ever get tripped up of, wait, is it align items, justify content, which one is which? It's a lifesaver. Additionally, there's I think Westbos, I forget how you pronounce his name, but he has this program, the What the Flexbox, and has a video series on learning Flexbox that is also great training material. So if that wasn't already melting your brain just a little bit, if you're new to some CSS stuff, there's also this concept of quantity queries for CSS. And there's a great article on a list apart that first I didn't really understand the practical use case. The examples they have are, they're okay. They illustrate how it can be used, but it wasn't until just recently I needed to use it in a practical example, and I'll have that for you here. So what we've learned about nth last child and first child and sibling selectors and everything there, what I can know is that if I want to target the first item on a list, I can do that. But what if I only want to target the first item if there's more than 6 of them? And so they have some examples on how to say, target the 6th one from the last, and if it's the first child, make it green. But then you can have another line of CSS that says, take the one that's 6th from the start, the first child, and then its siblings, also style it green. It's kind of a lot, but check this out. Where it could be cool is maybe you have a series of nav items that you want to use, like 20-point, type size. When it works fine, where you can space them evenly with that many, but next thing you know, you got to add a few more nav items. Well, now you want the font size to be a little bit smaller to accommodate that, or maybe less padding. So using the quantity query can be powerful there to have the CSS be more dynamic, if you will, that it'll respond better to edge cases that maybe when you handed off the theme or the project to the client, it worked fine, but yeah, they go add a couple items, you can build in a little bit of a safety net for them. And it worked out well for me. So I have this client who has a real estate website, and then when we first designed it, they were only putting 12 photos on the listings. And so I thought, okay, a grid of 4 would work fine. But as they started to use the site more and more, next thing you know, we had 30 plus photos on the website. So I wrote some styles that made it so if there are more than 30 items, to use a 20% grid instead of a 25% grid. So the 4-column grid would look something like this, where anything over, I guess, the medium breakpoint, set the width to be 25%. But based on what we've learned about quantity queries, and this gets deeper into the world of CSS algebra, when you're over the extra large breakpoint, so it's only, so that way it'll stay the 4 columns on just the large breakpoint. If something is the 30th from the last child, so that tells me there's at least 30 in the list, target that and all of its siblings and set the width to be 20%. So it worked out well. So on listings that have fewer photos, can have larger images, but I wanted to have the page not scroll as much and have a more compact photo gallery. And it was cool to see that just a couple lines of CSS solved a pretty awesome fix there. So now that we learned deeper into all the stuff CSS can do, let's get into like what I call the hardest part about CSS, and it's naming and methodologies. And like, what do I call this thing? Because even if you know how to write CSS, you could still sit there and be stumped on, what do I name this thing? Like that, you can name it anything. And so I want to introduce you to the concept called BEM. And it stands for Block Element Modifier. And it's used to create an extendable and reusable interface components. And so that says a whole lot of nothing. Well, so here's what it means. So you take this element, it's a block. And then you have a block element. So there's this element that lives within this block. And then you have a block element modifier. So if you look at this closely, you'll see that it's represented through a double underscore and a double hyphen to identify what the block is and what the element is and what the modifier is. So it looks complicated, but we're actually kind of already using it a lot if you're familiar with lots of different CSS frameworks out there. So take with this button here. What is this? We have a button and button primary. Or maybe you have button, button large. Realistically, all those are just modifiers to the base button. All button primary does in Bootstrap is sets the colors to blue, whereas button large will make the text larger and a little bit more padding. But all the base styles are tied into the button selector. So it's naming it in a way that your separation of concerns of what the styles do, so that way maybe all the border radius is tied to the button element. That has nothing to do with the color of the button, and you can build out a framework of lots of different button sizes and colors. And by using a dash or the double dash here, you're communicating to other developers that, hey, actually this is just the variant on that original button. So in a real life sense, we have like, you got your head, and you have on your head, you have your mouth. Your mouth, as far as I'm aware, can't live outside of your head. It's an element of the block of head. And something with your mouth is that it can be closed. And so it's communicating exactly what that element is and the variation that it is displaying as. And this one helped me really wrap my head around BEM. Whereas if you took another block, maybe it's your hand or your foot. Those are different than your head, and that would be a whole different block. You might have toes and fingers as part of those blocks. Where this you'll see is maybe you have an accordion and you have an accordion item, where you have the wrapping div in each of the items, and then maybe you have a status of it if that item is collapsed. So I just really enjoyed this naming convention, and it was helpful for a lot of team members that I've worked with, because without even seeing what the design looked like and just looking at the naming convention, you have a pretty good sense of what that item is and what it does. And I say it's just basically communication through naming. You can learn more about BEM on look up BEM info and the methodology of it. And there's other similar naming conventions called SMACs and like Atomic CSS. They all have their pros and cons. I just prefer to work with BEM. But that's just how we structure our classes. We didn't even get into talking about naming. So what I've done is I've created a Css Thesaurus. And for me, it's like a cheat sheet. And so if I really don't know what I want to name something and I'm just stumped, I'll go through as like, oh, is this a compartment? Is this a flourish? Is this an area? Is this a call out? Just having a go-to list of names can help you so that not everything is just a container or wrapper or box. It could be a little bit more descriptive of what it does. So I'd recommend having your go-to list. But most importantly is be consistent with how you're using it, because if you aren't consistent, you're going to open a project a month down the line and can't remember why you named it that. So that's naming. But now, one thing that I've seen a lot is as content management systems, whether WordPress, Drupal, and a few others that I've worked with, people will copy and paste from one source into the CMS and not realize that they're bringing inline styles with them, because some folks still cannot paste as plain text or paste and match style. So if I showed you this block of text and I said, show me which one has the inline style, you couldn't do it, because what if I told you, oh, it's that one right there. And where that's powerful is maybe you have your editor specific CSS. There's lots of different editor tools out there, but you can write conditional CSS based on like a parameter of like, oh, if it has a style element, make the color red and important. And so I know I said don't use important earlier, but in this case, it's more for, it's intended to have to smash through any of the styles that may be coming through from the pasted over styles, and to call out how to fix that issue. So this is not styles that are displayed to the website visitors. This is on just the content management side for your content contributors. So as they're adding content, they can quickly see where there's an issue and they need to clean up some of those inline styles, or maybe repaste as plain text. So it's just a helpful tool to help those do their job. There's so one thing I've learned a bit about lately is accessibility and the importance of like the alt attribute on an image. So say I have this image here, and that is me with my wife on a ride. One of us is clearly enjoying it, and then the other of us not so much. So the image source is miserable.jpg, but there's no descriptive text to it. So what you can do is you can hook into the image, and if it does not have an alt attribute, apply a 5-pixel red border. And so now you're, again, calling out this image is something's wrong with this. The person that added that image knows that red border isn't there, something's wrong, and it alerts them to resolve it. Similarly, maybe it has an alt attribute, but there's no value passed in. This is valid in some use cases if it's purely decorative, but you maybe want to give them a slight warning that, hey, if it's just empty, maybe you do want to double check and make sure if you want to put some descriptive text here. So what I've learned is that the descriptive text for this image is Evan miserable on California screaming roller coaster. And now we no longer have a red border or yellow border, and so it looks awesome. Another thing is with CSS is you can build really cool tools for yourself to make your job easier. So in Bootstrap, they have a handful of different breakpoints. And so like you have the small, medium, large, extra large, and there's all these different sizes. And so when you're doing these responsive styles, sometimes it can be a little confusing. Like, am I looking at the medium breakpoint or I'm looking at the large breakpoint? So I built myself a little tool. So as I'm scaling the window, it'll indicate what it does. So when it's on the small breakpoint, use this little icon. And I'll have a little video for that in a second. But here's kind of what it looks like, is that I put a pseudo element on the body. I position, fix it, fix the position on the bottom left, set the height, width, line height, just kind of general styles of it. Pointer events none, so you can click through it, and then just give it a super high z-index. That way it'll lay on top of the content. And so what's cool then is then I could use, and these are the Bootstrap media queries here, but on the small breakpoint, I can set the content to be SM and the background to red, and then medium, MD, background orange, and so on for large, and then extra large. And it would end up looking something like this as I'm going through the breakpoints. And so I have this example here. So as I make the window larger and larger, you'll see eventually a little box will appear up. Now it says small, now it's at the medium breakpoint, now it's at the large breakpoint, and now it's at the extra large breakpoint. And to me, I found that incredibly powerful and helpful when writing styles to know exactly what breakpoint I'm looking at. With that too comes pixel perfection. Now, not everything has to be pixel perfect, but here's something I want to run by you. Which one of these is the website and which one of these is the mockups, and can you see the difference? It's not clearly obvious, but I tell you and I assure you that they are different. So when you layer them on top of each other, what I've learned is that while the header was the correct size, the logo position was a little bit off, like it was sitting a little bit further down, and the spacing between the header and the breadcrumbs was off. And then I could see on the right side, the link padding was a bit off. And so while it looks close, it's not quite right. So what I went and did is I created a little mix-in for myself that allows me to it's not going to line up anymore. So that I found incredibly helpful. Now, just something that was fun that I found a couple years back was this concept of like a single div, and I would say this CSS drawing project by Lynn Fisher. And with how much cool stuff you can do with just CSS, all of these Star Wars illustrations are done with just a single div and a whole bunch of styles. So leveraging the div, what we actually get is we get two pseudo elements with the before and the after that we can style with leveraging multiple background gradients, shadows, border radius, sizing, and positioning. You can do illustrations that look like this. But the code looks something like this, and it gets pretty gnarly quickly. And you can look at it like, well, what is that? I mean, I see the idea is Leia, so I know it's an illustration of Leia, but who knew that if you look at these styles for this div and the before element, it would actually just create that. So I'd like to show you a little bit more of that in just a moment, but I've got a demo here. So I thought to myself, well, I can build something similar to that. Maybe not to the same illustration style, but what if I tried to make the game Simon with CSS? Could I do it? And I'd like to show you how I did it. I've got a couple of CodePen links there. I'll leave it on screen, so it's there for future reference. But let's see if I tab out here. Go to, can you see my screen still? I'm assuming so.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so here we have the single div, and so I think I said it was Lynn. She created a handful of animations and illustrations, all with just CSS. So if I go down here and inspect Leia, it's incredibly powerful. Like here's the before, here's the background image. You can start removing these elements, or maybe you're adjusting the position. Let me go in here. Maybe it's a little bit more to the left. And so I'd highly encourage checking that out if learning just what you can do with CSS alone. Like who would have thought a div and a whole bunch of styles, you can make awesome illustrations that would honestly take a lot of time to do, even just in like Illustrator. But with that challenge I saw here, I'll give you a CSS Simon. So the first one we have here, I got this wonderful box, and you can see in my markup, I just have a section element that's used just to position it using flex in the center of my screen. The main div here we're working with is the div of CSS Simon. And all I've done at this point for the first build of it is I set a height and width, and I'm gonna do position relative because I'm gonna need that in a bit, display block instead of background color. Got a nice little foundation there. Step 2, we're gonna start adding a couple of things here. Still only that single div, nothing hiding up here. At this point, we're going to put a border radius 50%. We're going to set a border width of 100 pixels, set the border style to solid, and then each of the borders, we're going to set a color. It's already starting to look a little bit like Simon, but we can go further. So what do we do next? Well, this is where we're starting to get fancy. What I've gone in and done is I put a transform rotate 45 degrees. So if I'll set this to 0 degrees, you'll see that's how it was. Let's see if it'll. So that's how it was before with the top left, bottom right. But I do 45. Now it's going to look similar to the photo that we saw earlier. And now we're using a box shadow to create a fake border around the outside, because I've already used the border elements to create the colors, but I knew I wanted this edge here. So I'm using a box shadow that isn't blurred to create the effect of a second border. Additionally, using a before and after to create these lines to divide these out. So if I change this to content none, oops, you'll see that they're no longer there. And all I'm doing here is positioning them on top, doing some math to line up where I want these to go and the left position calculated. And then I'm rotating each of those to overlay it. So it's getting closer, but we can still do more. Now, got a whole bunch more styles, because the CSS was starting to get a little bit more complicated with all the math involved. I switched my code pen over to be an SCSS panel and defining a whole bunch of different variables here. Where this is cool now is maybe I want my button size to be 50 pixels. And so these are all configurable up in these settings here. And I have this more organized, so that way I'm not having to define all the, I'll reference the variables in the styles, but all the math is kind of handled in one spot. So I went in and applied those variables to what we had before. And so now what I've done is, as I reference, the Simon edge size, or these variables are used in multiple places, so it'll update all the dependencies there. But now I'm using a before element to actually create the word Simon and the line, the horizontal line there, using the content field, and then set some styles. But because I had it rotated, I had to change the vertical writing mode. We can go further. So now I went in and created some mix-ins. So I got one to draw the lettering, and then I have a mix-in that draws the buttons. So each of these buttons in this, each of these arguments, I set a default color to the Simon button red. Button left is Simon button green, and apply these into this mix-in. So now, as I go down into the, where's it at? Here we go. I lost it. Include draw buttons. And so draw buttons is this mix-in. So it's just going to call it as is. I'm more or less just replacing the styles that I already had, but made it more configurable. But what I can do now is reload that. I went in and defined additional variables. So there's the Simon button lit, and I have a little bit brighter colors. The lit color has 100% opacity, where the dimmed out one has 0.15 opacity. And so I'm using the keyframe animation, make this panel a little wider. So at 0%, it's going to just draw the buttons, and they're going to be blank. And then at 10%, it's going to pass in the button top color to be lit. So, and using the transitions, it's transitioning essentially the opacity value of the color. It's transitioning the color value, which is different based on the opacity. And the Simon Says animation is where? I'm calling on CSS Simon div. I'm calling the animation of Simon Says, telling it there's 10 steps and to loop infinitely. But this is moving incredibly fast, so maybe you want to slow that down a bit. Let's change that to like 10 seconds. So I think this is the speed that I can play at now, but I guess really what I'm trying to convey is a lot of folks think CSS is just about making button styles or websites with just like your links, navigation. But if you tinker around with it enough, you could make pretty cool little illustrations or proof of concepts. So that's all I have. Thanks, everybody.
quick question. Sorry about that. That was really awesome. And also, I was wondering about processing speed. Does that affect, like, depending on how much code you put into, how much CSS you put into each, I guess, animation? Does that affect processing speed in any way, or no, not really?
You can definitely bog down a browser with too much animation. There's actually, in one of the inspect panels, you can see the animation frame, and you can see if there's dips in the frame rate. That if the machine is not a powerful machine, you could definitely see dips in the frame rate. I've seen projects where we've tried to throw a lot of animation at it, and it's not as buttery smooth like you'd want it to be, like 60 frames a second. And you could look at what's doing that. There's going to be some properties that if you animate, it's going to be way more taxing on the browser. I couldn't name them all off the top of my head, but there's plenty of articles out there that'll say what elements are going to be harder to animate. Like if you're animating like a box shadow and have it grow wider as it's animating, that could potentially like be more taxing. But if you're doing animating something and moving it and then moving everything around, it's your web browser. The CSS isn't meant to do all that stuff, but you can do it if you want. Does that help at all?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Let's see, is there a couple things in chat that I missed? No, I had it on full screen, so I may have missed.
You're good. I don't think there were any questions in there. Just people commenting about how rad that was mostly. Thank you, Evan. That was awesome. I was hoping you would show the Darth Vader demo again. I saw you use that in a presentation a while back, and
that's awesome.
That's great. I have stolen your demo from a single div and used that in a couple of the CSS classes I've taught since then too, and I show that to students all the time, and they that always gets everyone's mind just blown. Like, oh my God, you can do all that stuff with one div tag? Like, yep. See, learn your CSS. You can do all kinds of rad things with it.
Yeah.
Evan, I have a question for you. Are you starting to use some of the stuff that's in SCSS that's making its way natively into native CSS, like variables there and that kind of stuff? Are you starting to use some of that stuff yet?
I have. I think where I haven't used it yet is if I ever want to do my own math functions on top of it before I compile it. Like if I want to use darken and lighten and that sort of thing. I'm not 100% up to speed with the browser support of exactly what we can do with it. I know there were some hurdles with you trying to do addition and like some of the math involved in some of the variables, that there were some limitations on using calc in the browser, that it's a little bit easier to pre-compile it that way. But that was a couple of years back when they were just jumping through hoops of like, oh, you just got to multiply it by -1 and then add half a pixel and then divide it by 100. It's like, this is just insane. Just use SCSS. But like, has it developed more at this point? Likely, but I haven't gone full speed ahead on the CSS variables. I do think it's cool. You'll see in a lot of frameworks they have done that. So like if you look at like Bootstrap or probably even Foundation, if you inspect, you'll see the body tag. It says colon root. Like here's all the root styles that get defined. So it's really cool to see that you can do it in browser now, though.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
It's helpful if you have like maybe just a small proof of concept that you want to build out, that you do want to have those variables, and you don't have to wire up everything in Sass. But yeah. Any other questions?
No.
I'll be sure to get Nolan those links. So if anybody wants to dissect that Simon, I know I kind of rushed through it and I had to wrap my head around it again from when I originally wrote it. But they are in CodePen if you want to inspect it and tinker with it. And that's why I built it out step by step, so that if somebody really wants to see how it was built upon, that it could be helpful to learn some of that.
Cool.
Yeah, send me the links. I'll include that when we post the video and all that stuff for you.
That was really cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Nolan. Appreciate it. It's always great to share some things here.
Yeah, thanks very much, Evan. Always a pleasure, dude.